Today we'll be examining English Renaissance or early modern poetry in depth, discussing its influences, some of its forms, and a few of its interesting poets. At the end of the lecture, I'll be talking a little bit more about Elizabeth I as a patroness of the arts and as an inspiration for art and literature. Petrarch, or Francesco Petrarca, was an Italian ambassador, lawyer, and writer who lived from 1304 to 1374. He was a contemporary of Chaucer, who was definitely influenced by Petrarch, but Petrarch also personally knew the other great Florentine writers of the Italian Renaissance, Dante and Boccaccio, who were alive at the same time. Petrarch's most famous and influential work was Canzoniere, or Songbook, a collection of 366 poems. Petrarch drew thematic inspiration for his work from troubadour songs and from the ideals of courtly love that had been circulating around Europe for several centuries. But he also drew inspiration, or drew the sonnet form from Sicily. Frederick II of Sicily presided over a sophisticated court that valued argument and precision in writing, and the sonnet form was developed in his court several decades and centuries before Petrarch composed his first sonnet. The muse for Petrarch's sonnets was a woman he only identifies as Laura, but she may be Laura de Noves, the wife of Count Hugh de Sade. Petrarch fell in love with her after seeing her in church on Good Friday, 1327. He proceeded to haunt the church in hopes of seeing her again, and he even later bought a small estate near her home in Avignon. Laura, as a married noblewoman, was out of Petrarch's league, so we can see how she fits the ideal of the beloved in the courtly love protocol. Laura never returned Petrarch's affection, by the way, and she died of the plague in 1348. Petrarch continued to write sonnets dedicated to Laura, and she became even more unattainable after her death. Besides popularizing the sonnet for a pan-European audience, Petrarch's sonnets are responsible for several other poetic conventions. It is in Petrarch that we find the following color scheme of ideal beauty: golden hair, red lips, and white skin. This ideal of female beauty still lingers with us today. It is also in Petrarch that we get widespread use of the blason, or a cataloging of the subject's physical attributes. For example, to quote a country western song popular when I was in college, she's got ruby red lips, blonde hair, blue eyes, and I'm about to kiss my heart goodbye. That's John Michael Montgomery's Sold, the Grundy County auction incident, by the way. You can probably think of some more recent popular songs that include blasons. It is a very, very old art form. Let's now look at one of Petrarch's famous sonnets, Rima 190. Here you can see how it looks in Italian. See if you can recognize any of the words, which you might if you know Spanish, French, or Latin. That first word, that V, is actually what we would do in modern day as a U, so that's una. Candida is white, and that's cerva, a deer, a white deer. And so you might see some other words that you recognize there if you know a Romance language, or maybe you know Italian. Here's a translation you have in your anthology. The translation is by Robert K. Durling, and it does not attempt to reproduce Petrarch's rhyme scheme. Durling is aiming for accuracy of translating ideas instead of following the form precisely. You can find this on pages 121 through 122 of the anthology, and is part of your assigned reading, which we'll do together now as I read it aloud. Petrarch's Rima 190. A white doe on the green grass appeared to me with two golden horns between two rivers in the shade of a laurel when the sun was rising in an unripe season. Her look was so sweet and proud that to follow her I left every task, like the miser who as he seeks treasure sweetens his trouble with delight. Let no one touch me, she bore written in diamonds and topazes around her lovely neck. It has pleased my Caesar to make me free. And the sun had already turned at midday. My eyes were tired by looking, but not sated, when I fell into the water, and she disappeared. On the surface, this poem is about a white deer who comes to the sonnet speaker while he's resting by a river. She is so beautiful that the speaker tries to follow her. She wears a necklace that says, "Don't touch me, Caesar has made me free." The speaker, worn out by his pursuit, falls into the water, and the deer disappears. There's a dreamy quality to this poem. In fact, the whole appearance of the deer might have been a vision. We see the Petrarchan color scheme in the deer's coloring: white fur, golden horns. And the deer is standing in the shade of a laurel, il lauro in Italian. You can see the similarities, which aren't a coincidence, to the name of Petrarch's love, Laura. Most people would agree that the deer here is supposed to represent a woman, particularly Laura de Noves. Now let's look at Sir Thomas Wyatt's version, which he calls Whoso Lists to Hunt. This poem was written, taking Rima 190 as an inspiration, in the 1530s. Whoso lists to hunt basically means whoever thinks they want to hunt. I'll read it aloud to you now, and then you can read along with me. It's also on page 121 of the Norton Anthology, Volume B, and is part of our assigned reading for this week. As I read, think about what's similar and what's different from Petrarch's Rima 190. Whoso lists to hunt, I know where is an hind. But as for me, alas, I may no more. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore. I am of them that farthest cometh behind. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer, but as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow. I leave off, therefore, sithens in a net I seek to hold the wind. Who list her hunt, I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain. Engraven with diamonds in letters plain, there is written her fair neck round about, Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. So how is this deer different from Petrarch's? Is she also a woman? I'd say yes, of course, but we don't know what she looks like, as Wyatt, unlike Petrarch, does not describe her looks. She does have a necklace that says Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, instead of let no one touch me, for Caesar has set me free. Do you see the distinction? Wyatt also adds that line, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame, at the end. This deer has been claimed by Caesar instead of freed by him, so the deer, though wilder than Petrarch's doe, has less freedom. The hunt is also characterized differently in this sonnet. In Petrarch's version, you don't get the sense that there are other competitors, but in Wyatt's, the speaker is one of them that farthest cometh behind. In other words, he's got the longest odds of any of the deer's pursuers of actually catching her. The whole tone of the poem is more pessimistic and less dreamlike than Petrarch's vision. Many have speculated that Wyatt is talking about a specific woman here, just like Petrarch was, and that this woman was perhaps even more unattainable than Laura de Noves. Who was Wyatt's hind, who is off limits because Caesar has claimed her? Why, Anne Boleyn, the woman Henry VIII pursued for years because she wouldn't become his mistress. By the way, this poem would have circulated in manuscript and would have been passed around a coterie of fellow courtiers. More on this later. When Anne Boleyn was thrown into the Tower of London, Sir Thomas Wyatt was also jailed for a time, suspected of having had an affair with Anne. He was freed and cleared of the charge, but you see just how dangerous this hind was to follow too closely. Let's talk for a bit about the generic features of sonnet from Petrarch to modern day. Traditionally, like Petrarch's sonnets, English sonnets are about frustrated love, though people were deviating from this theme as early as Shakespeare's day. Sonnets feature oxymoronic phrases or compressed conflicts, words that seem to be fighting each other in some way, like binding freedom or cold burning. Sonnets are 14 lines long. If you see a poem printed in the anthology that roughly resembles a square, then start counting lines. You're likely looking at a sonnet. Every sonnet contains a volta, or a rhetorical turn. Where the volta occurs in the poem depends on what kind of sonnet it is. We'll talk about the major types of English Renaissance sonnets in a few moments. I hinted at sonnet culture a little bit ago when I told you the gossip about Sir Thomas Wyatt and Anne Boleyn. At this time period, poems were written out by hand, or in manuscript, and circulated among a small group of fellow amateur writers. We call these people a coterie. The expectations for those that surround rulers had certainly changed over the centuries between Beowulf and Sir Thomas Wyatt. In Hrothgar's hall, Beowulf is expected to be a good fighter, like drinking mead, and be great at boasting. In Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, we see that Sir Gawain is not only a brave fighter, but he is also an excellent conversationalist who knows how to entertain ladies. By the time of Elizabeth I's court, courtiers could claim writing poetry as a desirable skill. We'll talk about why this was later on in the lecture. Another thing to know about sonnets in English is that people who are writing them are basically flexing. To be able to capture a complicated argument in such a small space, the writer must be skilled indeed. And he or she, and there were female sonneteers in this time period, and female coterie poets too, must follow a strict meter and rhyme scheme. Add these skills to the fact that English, unlike Italian, is difficult to rhyme, and you can see why writing a good sonnet is still considered the feat of an accomplished poet. Anyone who is attempting to write a sonnet is saying something about their confidence in communicating a complex idea inside the confines of 14 lines of rhymed iambic pentameter. Maybe that's why a good number of sonnets are actually about writing sonnets. Many poets from this time period were not published until after the writer's death. For instance, Sir Thomas Wyatt's sonnets were composed in the 1530s, but not printed until the 1550s. Some sonneteers, like Sir Philip Sidney, were especially protective of their privacy. Types of sonnets. After the sonnet hit the big time in England, English poets not only wrote sonnets, but also developed some of their own sonnet forms. I am going to introduce you to the three main types of sonnets during this period, as they appeared in English literature. First, we have the Petrarch sonnet. This is the form English writers used initially, and it remained popular for many centuries. In fact, William Wordsworth's Nuns Fret Not, for instance, was written in the early 1800s, but still used the Petrarchan form. This form involves an octave, or 8 lines of poetry, and then a sestet, or 6 lines. Between the octave and the sestet lies the volta, or rhetorical turn. In a Petrarchan sonnet, the last 6 lines are a kind of answer to the first 8 lines. While the rhyme scheme for the sestet can vary somewhat, the usual rhyme scheme overall is ABBA, ABBA, octave, and CDE, CDE, sestet. The Shakespearean sonnet, made popular by Shakespeare, of course, follows a different pattern. Shakespearean sonnets present 3 quatrains, or groups of 4 verses, each one developing an idea a little further. Then the volta occurs between lines 12 and 13, with the last 2 lines being a rhyming couplet. The rhyme scheme for a Shakespearean sonnet is ABAB, CDCD, EFEF, and GG. Edmund Spenser is another early modern writer who was a prolific sonnet composer, although we won't have time to read any of his works this summer. He wrote a long poem called The Faerie Queene that I will mention later in this lecture. Spenser, like Shakespeare, uses the 3 quatrain plus couplet scheme, but his rhyme scheme interlaces a bit more than Shakespeare's. The Spenserian sonnet is written like this: ABAB, BCBC, CDCD, EE. The volta, as in Shakespearean sonnets, occurs right before the last 2 lines. I am now going to mention a little bit about scansion, or determining the meter in poetry. Don't worry, we won't get into too much detail here, as most of the poetry we'll read from our course's time period is written in one type of meter, iambic pentameter. You may have heard that term and didn't really know what it meant precisely. I'm hoping to shed a little bit of light on that now. Iambic meter refers to poetry that has a dum-dum, dum-dum rhythm to the words, where the second syllable receives more stress than the first. Dum-dum, 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 etc. Each of these dum-dums pairs is called an iamb. To find out the number of feet per meter, or iambs, you just count the iambs. The most common poetic meter in the English language is iambic pentameter, meaning there are 5 iambs per line of poetry. Chaucer is credited with developing iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter is not a universal poetic meter, however. The Iliad and the Odyssey, those ancient Greek epics you may have read before, are written in dactylic hexameter in their original Greek. I'd love to dive deeper into the different types of meter, but alas, we must move on today. We're now going to look at a sonnet that is not part of your assigned reading. It's by Sir Philip Sidney, a courtier poet. I'm inserting a video here so that I can teach you line by line. This is faster for me because I'm not 100% great with technology, especially with videoing. I'll be looking at Sonnet 91 from Astrophil and Stella from your textbook. The blue is a link on YouTube where you can watch the video. I'm actually going to stop this part of the lecture here, and we'll start up the next part of the lecture with this poetry analysis. See you soon.